There was a time when these stories were called conspiracy theories, dismissed, ignored, laughed at. People who talked about them were seen as paranoid, but years later, documents were released, files were declassified, and what sounded impossible turned out to be real. Genius. This is not speculation. These are confirmed operations, events that were hidden, denied, and eventually exposed. Compares because sometimes the truth doesn't come out right away. It takes years, decades, and it finally surfaces. It changes everything. One of the clearest examples of this was a plan so shocking it was almost impossible to believe. In the early 1960s, at the height of the Cold War, tensions between the United States and Cuba were rising rapidly. The world was already on edge. Nuclear weapons, political instability, fear, and closed doors. A proposal was created. It wasn't meant for the public. It was meant to be seen. The plan, Operation Northwoods. And on paper, it looked like a strategy, a way to justify military action. But details were something else entirely. The proposal suggested staging attacks, not real attacks. Fake ones, designed to look real. Acts, terrorism against American targets. Its planes could be hijacked. Ships could be attacked. Even civilians could be placed in danger. It's the purpose to blame it Cuba, to create a reason for war. Depends. At the time, this idea sounded unthinkable, impossible, but a rumor. It wasn't a theory. It written down, approved by high-ranking officials, and presented as a real option. And the only reason didn't happen was because it was rejected at the highest level. Years later, when the documents were finally declassified, people stunned. Because this wasn't speculation anymore. It proof. Proof then like this had been seriously considered. And it raised a question that still lingers. If a plan could exist, how many others saw the light of day? Because Operation Northwoods wasn't an isolated idea. It was part of a mindset, a way of where perception mattered more than reality. And understand that other events start to look different. Because case wasn't war. It was about surveillance, about watching people without them ever knowing. For years, it was dismissed as paranoia. People believed they were being monitored, tracked, observed, and the same thing that not happening. And what? Because 2013, a series of leaks revealed something that changed how people saw the modern world. Mass surveillance. Not targeted, not limited. What's global? Programs that collected data from millions of people. Phone calls, messages, online activity. All quietly gathered, stored, analyzed, and people had no idea. The information came from a whistleblower, someone who had access to the system, someone who decided to reveal it. And documents were released. The reaction is immediate. Unrest, shock, disbelief, anger, because once again, something had been denied turned out to be real. The Mills governments responded. Explanations were given. Policies were discussed. But one thing couldn't be undone. The realization that far more information was being collected than anyone had imagined. And line crossed. It changed. People viewed privacy forever. Afraid. Because something like could exist without public awareness. What else could? And this is where the pattern becomes impossible to ignore. An idea appears. It's dismissed, labeled unrealistic. And then later, it's confirmed and fully not specimen enough to prove real. And the deeper you go, the more often you see it happen. Because next case was even more unsettling. Not because of what it revealed, but because how long it remained hidden. And when the truth finally came out, it forced people to confront something uncomfortable. But sometimes the most dangerous secrets aren't the ones that sound impossible, but that sound just believable enough to be ignored. By 1940s, the world had just come out of one of the most devastating wars in history. Nations were rebuilding, trust was fragile, and new global tensions were already beginning to rise. And behind the scenes, another operation quietly unfolding. It wasn't announced, it wasn't explained, and for years, it remained almost completely unknown. Now, the operation was called Project Sunshine. At glance, the name sounded harmless, even positive, but it involved was something far more disturbing. The goal of the project was to study the effects of nuclear radiation on the human body, specifically how radioactive material spread after nuclear explosions. To do that, scientists needed data. Data. And to get it, raised serious ethical questions. With public knowledge, samples were collected from human remains and bones, tissues. In many cases, taken consent, and families were never informed. Children among those affected, because it's believed that younger bodies would provide clearer data. And so the collection continued quietly, systematically, across locations, different front, all connected to a single objective. It to understand how radiation moves through human body. For years, none of this was widely known. The program operated in the background till details to surface. Reports, documents, investigations, tons. And once again, something that sounded too disturbing to be real was confirmed. Public reaction was immediate. Is there shock, disbelief, anger? It's because this wasn't just about science. What? It was about how far people were willing to go without transparency. And then the line is crossed. It changes how everything is viewed. As because if something this could happen without public awareness, what else could? And but Project Sunshine wasn't the only operation of its kind. Others, uh, programs that operated quietly. Programs were designed not to be noticed, and went further, not by collecting data, but by actively targeting people to terrorize. For years, activists began to notice something unusual. Their movements were being tracked, their communication monitored. Some reported harassment. Others noticed patterns that didn't make sense. At the time, these claims were dismissed, at labeled paranoia. But later, documents reveal something very different. Is there a program known as COINTELPRO, run by FBI? Its purpose to monitor, disrupt, control certain groups and individuals, and civil rights leaders, political activists, organizations seen as threats. Aims methods included surveillance, infiltration, psychological pressure, and, in some cases, deliberate attempts to damage reputations, and to create division, to spread distrust. Most of it was done without public knowledge. For years, it remained hidden until documents were exposed. And once again, what had been denied was confirmed. Because the pattern kept repeating. Something happens in secret. People to notice. They are dismissed. And then, years later, the truth surfaces. Not completely, but enough. Enough to show what once sounded impossible. Real. And at this point, the question no longer if. It becomes how often. Because the final case is one of the most debated. Not because there's no evidence, but because how it was presented. And even today, people still argue what really happened. But is certain. Something changed. And the explanation given didn't convince everyone. In 1964, an event took place that would later shape the course of history. A report came in, and an attack. And it was said that U.S. ships had been targeted in the waters, the Gulf of Tonkin. The situation escalated quickly. The attack was presented as clear, confirmed after Alatim, and the response was immediate. Military action was approved. The event became one of the key reasons for deeper involvement in the Vietnam War. And at the time, there was doubt. The narrative was simple. An attack had happened. Action was justified. But years later, questions began to emerge. Rumors, not speculation. documents, declassified information, and and what they revealed far more complicated. Uh, because, according to later findings, one of the reported attacks may not have happened at all. Conflicting signals, unclear data, misinterpretations, found, and yet the original story unchanged. Theory presented as fact. Because by the time doubts appeared, the decision had already been made. And consequences were already unfolding. Thousands of lives, years of conflict, all influenced by an event that was not as clear as it was first presented. And this is where the pattern becomes undeniable. Because it's not always about creating something entirely false. It's a nerd. Sometimes it's about presenting incomplete information as certainty and firm. And that certainty is accepted. Everything is built on it. Then happens years later, when the full picture begins to appear, it doesn't undo what has already happened. It only raises questions. Questions about decisions, about timing, what was known, and then when. And then case is one of the clearest examples. Not because it was hidden forever, but because by the time it was understood, it was too late to change anything. And when you back at everything we've covered, a pattern starts to emerge. Different events, different contexts, but the same underlying structure. It ain't. Information is limited. Narratives are formed. Decisions are made. And the truth takes years surface. If it surfaces at all. And said, because not every story is fully revealed. Some remain incomplete. Some are lost in fragments. Some are still unfolding. But history has shown that certain things once dismissed as conspiracy have later proven true. Not all, not similar, to make people question, keep and to look closer. Because the line between what is dismissed and is eventually confirmed is not always as clear as it seems. And that's what unsettling. Because if something can be ignored for years and to be real, then one question remains. What else is still waiting to be uncovered? Beyond the surface.